Welcome back, glad you could join me. Firstly, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who commented on the last video about the number of videos that you are wanting a week. It was a well-resounding one better quality video a week, so that's what I'm going to be doing from now on. As for today, I'm going to be doing a video on making a new product, so I'm going to be making a little heart hook, and I want to make some jigs for it so I can, do a proper production line and do a batch production on making these hooks so I can then sell them on my website or at craft fairs or wherever. But I'm going to take you through the processes that I go through when making a new product and making a jig for a new product. I wanted to show you this hook quickly, which is going to be the style that I'm going to go for, as I want all of my sort of hooks to look, the same. So the bottom half is going to be identical, as I already have the jig for making the hook itself, so I'm going to use the same jig so that they are the same, and people can then buy an animal head one. This is a Highland cow's head, but they could then buy one of these ones as well as a heart hook, and they still look the same and as if they're made by the same person. I will show you how I make the bottom half, but I've done that before. Today is more about the top half with the heart and how I take a product and make a jig to then speed up the process of making it. To start, I'm going to come on the near edge of the anvil and just make a little set down. I've got a mark here at 1 3/4 of an inch. So we'll set down that material, isolating it off, and then we can split it and forge it into the heart. That'll do. It really doesn't take very much, just a nice little set down. At the moment, this looks like the start of one of my animal heads. So like a ram's head, it's exactly the same as this, and then we split it with an angle grinder, like I'm about to do, to get our two halves. And I like to do this cold with an angle grinder rather than doing it hot. I've said this loads of times, but I like to do it cold so that we get a nice clean cut. If we cut it hot with a chisel, we're obviously going to leave the form of the chisel in the cut, creating two rhombuses. And you don't really want to forge a rhombus because it's a rhombus and it doesn't like to be forged. So you then have to come back and grind those angles down so that it's nice and parallel rather than it being a rhombus. And so you're going to end up having to file or grind them anyway, even after you've done a hot cut. So you might as well just cut it with an angle grinder, or at least that's my view as a modern blacksmith. If you want to be more traditional, you can use a hacksaw, or you can, of course, just cut it hot and then file it back. I'll split the ends. And now draw out a nice taper on both of them. You'll see I've made a mark here from the edge of my anvil, and that's so that I can match my length of both of these two tines, let's call them, or halves of the heart. And this is 70mm. I know I'm jumping from imperial to metric and all over the places. That was 1 1/4 inch, 1 3/4, and this is now 70mm. But whatever, it's a nice round number, so we'll use it for our length. I'm just going to come on and knock the corners off, so it's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing rather than it being sharp. I think just knocking the corners off makes it look a little bit better. Now I can move on to the actual shape of the heart, and I'm just going to go with like a really generic shape for the heart. Nice and simple, so no sort of curls or scrolls on the inside of the heart. It's just going to come together and meet, as I think that's going to be the easiest shape to then make a jig to make the shape. Also, because this is going to be the first one and the one that I use to make the jig, I want this to be as perfect as it can be. So I'm going to take my time, get a really nice shape, which we can then use to make a jig off, and then hopefully replicate that nice shape every time we then make one of these hooks. I'm going to start by just using a pair of scrolling tongs, and what I want to do is sort of bring these two ends together so that the end of the heart is fading out down to the point, and then we can begin to bring the ends around. This is where we are at the moment. You can see it is just a really simple heart, but that's sort of my idea with this is, you know, design with less is more in mind, and try and create a product, a hook that is going to be cheaper, a cheaper version to the animal head hook. So hopefully, you know, customers then have an option of having a heart hook or going a little bit more expensive and trying a animal head hook. The next step, as I said, is of course making the jig, and we've got to make sure that we go on the inside edge of this shape to make sure that we create this shape when we then use the jig. As if we just make a jig that is the same as this heart, then we're gonna, when we use the jig, we're gonna make something that is bigger, because of course you always bend on the outside of the jig, so it's always going to be bigger than the jig itself. For the jig, I'm going to be using this piece, which is 20 by 5mm bar. I've already bent up one half, so you can see that that is going to fit up into our heart. For the second half of the jig, instead of matching it to the heart that I've already made, I'm just going to match it to this half. So when I'm bending this up now, instead of referring back to the original piece, which was what I did for this one, I'm just going to refer to this instead, so that I know that the two halves are going to be identical, because I'm just referencing it back to the original half. That's pretty much bob on, so I can cut it off and weld them together. This piece is all done. You notice that I ground these corners off so that it comes down to a nice thin point, and that's so that it fits right down in there in the actual sort of joint between the two halves of our heart, and it is pretty good on the fit up on the original heart, so that's always a bonus, which means that the shape that this will create when we actually use it as a jig will be pretty much the same as this one. Of course, at the moment, it's not much of a jig, it's just a little heart, so I'm going to weld it onto a piece of angle iron and then weld a couple of other tabs on, so that when we're actually creating the heart, we create it square to the piece rather than it being offset to one side. I've got the jig all welded up. You can see I didn't do a very good job of getting the heart square to the bit of angle iron, so it means our bar is going to be coming off at this angle, but it's okay, we should be able to use it. So I'll get it in the vise, get a piece of steel in the fire, and then show you how I'm actually going to use it. I've already tapered out this bar just the same as last time, so these tapers are at 70mm long. You can see that the bar is going to fit in there nicely. We can then get a pair of mole grips clamp it down so it's not going to move anywhere, and then just simply bend it to the heart shape. There's a couple of things that could go wrong with it. The first one obviously is these lengths not being long enough. In that case, you can either unbend it, taper them out a bit more, or just simply change the shape of the heart and tap the halves in a little bit to close the gap up at the far end. The other thing that could go wrong is that they're too long, and so if they're too long, we can always just cut a little bit off the end. The reason why the clamp or the mole grips, whatever you want to call them, is there is so that the bar doesn't go anywhere. As if we were just holding it in, it's going to be moving about a little bit, especially when we are forging these outward bends or concavity bends. It always likes to pull the steel in, so we've got to be a bit careful and just make sure that it's clamped down so it's definitely not going to move anywhere in the jig whilst we're bending both of the sides. Otherwise the heart might be off to one side. Anyway, I'll get it in the fire, get it hot, and then show you how I do it. So that one we've got a little bit too long, about 2 mil too long on the taper, so I can just quickly trim the end off of that. That one there, we're bob on the length. Now for the tricky part, getting it out of the jig. There we go. So you can see, obviously it needs a bit of a straighten, but this tine is just a little bit too long, so I can just come on there, even just with a file, and file that back so that it is then the correct length. Here are the two hearts. Hopefully you can see them well enough. This one was the original one, which we made the jig off, and then this is the one that I've just finished up now, and you can see they are pretty much identical, so I'm really happy with how the jig has actually worked. The only problem is in getting the hearts out of the jig, but what I'm going to do is grind a taper from the bottom of the jig to the top, so it's a bigger heart at the bottom than it is at the top, so hopefully it'll just easily slide off rather than it being a bit of a wrestle to get the heart out of there. I'll put this one back in the fire and actually forge it into the finished product. I'll get the countersinks forged in first, and then we can cut it off the bar and forge the hook out. This is just a ball fuller, nothing fancy. Here's the finished hook. All that I did was drill some holes in those countersinks rather than punching them. This thing is a little bit cleaner, as it's always a bit tricky to punch a hole in a countersink. But I think this is going to be a really nice little product to add to the collection of things that I sell. So, you know, it's still in that same style of hook as the animal head hook. It's just a different finial, let's call it, at the top of the hook. And so hopefully it's going to be priced as a little bit cheaper than the animal head hook, so it's a different alternative and a different theme, obviously, to the animal heads. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video and seeing the processes that I go through to actually come up with a product and then think about making it, and how you then can make a jig to make making the product a lot quicker and easier for me as a blacksmith. So now I can just put several pieces of steel in the fire, do a proper batch production, so it speeds things up, just being able to go to a jig for both the heart and the hook. I've shown the hook jig in other videos, as I said, so I did put it in, but it was only there for a very brief amount of time. But it's literally, you just put a piece of steel in and bend it around to then create the same hook shape every time. Anyway, that's about it, so thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you on the next one.